Is it better with light or no light? Okay, we can start. So as yeah, I presume that means we're streaming. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, good. Okay. So my name is Doug Laxton, and I'm filling in for our Czech expert that has COVID, and our other expert on the UK um, that had a dental procedure, but they've sent me some slides and so on. So this is going to be a little bit like a trip down memory lane because I'm going to be talking quite a bit about the historical experience at the Czech National Bank. I was heavily involved um, doing technical assistance there. So soon after leaving the Bank of Canada in 1993 to go and work at the research department of the International Monetary Fund, I had a number of invitations, starting with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, about how to develop a forecasting and policy analysis system to support what we know today as flexible inflation targeting and so on. But back in New Zealand, they didn't quite understand that they were trying to target inflation in a narrow band, and that resulted in pretty extreme instability in the real economy. Effectively using the interest rate to influence the exchange rate to keep inflation in a narrow band resulted in bad consequences for their traded goods sector. You can read about that in a LSE working paper by Cameron Hayworth, Asyakostanyan, and myself on the history of monetary policy in New Zealand and the development of this forecasting and policy analysis system. So we recently, the Central Bank of Armenia invited me to help them develop the next generation of forecasting and policy analysis system, which we named a prudent risk management approach to monetary policy. And the idea being that it would deal better with issues related to uncertainty and non-linearities and so on. So all the FPAS frameworks, whether or not they're FPAS Part 1, like the Czech National Bank or the Reserve Bank of New Zealand or Bank that, or Central Bank of Chile and Georgia and Armenia, before Armenia, of course, adopted Mark II, are based on forward-looking monetary policy framework. And so this is absolutely fundamental to understand about how these central banks think about monetary policy and the economy and so on. So the three essential ingredients that must be satisfied to be an FPAS central bank is: where's the economy today? So trying to understand how much excess demand or excess supply one has in the market for goods and services, or the market for labor, and so on. What are the underlying forces driving the economy? So if when we're to think about it, driving a car, where are we on the road, and are we heading towards the ditch? And of course, the last question, which seems rather obvious, but unfortunately hasn't been implemented in many advanced economy central banks like the Bank of England or the ECB, and to some extent even the Fed, because of their dot plot issue and so on. But the third question is, what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives and so on. And that's not satisfied because in the forecasts that are produced at the Bank of England, it's always based on an exogenous path for the policy rate. And so, obviously, the extreme example of that is back during COVID when the policy rate assumption was constant at 1% and inflation was in the double digits and so on. And so that is illegal in FPAS central banks to ever do something like that because the whole idea of developing the framework, okay, is that it should be impossible to peg the interest rate. It's impossible for monetary policy to peg the interest rate for the system to have a null anchor because the idea is that if inflation, which in that forecast that was published by the Bank of England, if that inflation forecast is double digits like it was, and the interest rate was only 1%, and you said you were going to keep the interest rate 1% for forever, then the real interest rate would be very negative because 1% interest rate and double-digit inflation means the real interest rate would be minus 10%. And that then, of course, in our analytical frameworks would say people would be spending money to try to get ahead of rising prices in the future, or the low real interest rates would result in an incentive to spend now, borrow now, because real interest rates are really, really low. And so in our models, what makes that doing something like that illegal is the models don't have a normal anchor under the assumption of exogenous interest rates. Okay. And the argument applies equally to a constant interest rate or a time varying interest rate that is taken from the market. Okay. So what the Bank of England is doing is illegal from the perspective of FPAS central banks. Now, as I'm going to go through, because I'm going to go through a bit of the history of developing FPAS Mark I central banks, and with specific reference to the Czech National Bank and so on. And so, as you can see in the table with the little space shuttles, Mark I and Mark II, the Mark I central banks satisfy these three essential ingredients in the sense that they provide forecasts that have an assumption for the policy rate that is determined by the model and has to be adjusted up or down sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation and inflation expectations. So the big problem with FPAS Mark I is dealing with uncertainty. In other words, the framework wasn't designed specifically to deal with uncertainty and nonlinearity. So many FPAS Mark I central banks have linearized DSGE kinds of models versus, as we're going to talk about, investing in human capital so that you have economists that are good at building all kinds of models, including more complicated nonlinear models to think about issues of uncertainty. The second thing is the policy of least regrets. This is terminology that was borrowed from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to get at the idea that we don't want to just think about optimizing or finding the path on the road for the car that is in the perfect place, but we all want to think about avoiding really bad things happening. So staying away from the cliffs where there can be really, really bad outcomes for the economy, or to use the terminology of my good friend and old boss at the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, where he referred to it as avoiding dark corners where danger lurks. So inside those dark corners are non-linearities. So non-linearities are the uh, the kind of bread and butter for the researcher to think about implications of uncertainty, because when there are non-linearities, there can be big costs associated with having bad policies. Now, Mark II is basically trying to deal with the uncertainty by using scenario analysis. And so we refer to these scenarios called case A and case B. And so these are scenarios where under A, the interest rate path, the expected interest rate path, which is the thing that influences expected market interest rates and the exchange rate through interest rate differentials. It's that is which is what affects the economy and so on. So that's depicted in this little trademark chart that I created a very long time ago to try to explain monetary policy to people that didn't understand models or how to build models. That what was important was not the setting of the policy rate today, but the setting of the policy rate today plus forward guidance that influences longer term market interest rates of longer maturity that affect things like mortgage rates and consumer loan rates. And of course, it's that expected path that also influences the exchange rate and so on. And so these transmission channels going particularly from longer term interest rates to aggregate demand affecting the state of excess demand or excess supply conditions in the economy is the thing that ultimately determines stickier prices like wages and what we call non-traded sticky prices in the economy. Obviously, there are also flexible prices that respond to the exchange rate, prices that are set, that are internationally traded and determined to a large extent by exchange rate. So in the transmission mechanism, we got to keep all those things accounted for properly if we're going to think about finding the expected path of the policy rate that's consistent with a scenario. In this case, case A is one where inflationary conditions, maybe underlying inflation or excess demand conditions, is such that interest rates have to be higher than what's currently priced in financial markets, and vice versa. A case B scenario is one where demand conditions are weaker and underlying inflation is lower than what's priced in financial markets. Thus, financial markets over time under that scenario would learn that interest rates have to be lower than what's currently priced in. So case A and case B scenario provide, as well as a process that you can read about in the book that we recently published at the Central Bank of Armenia. So the draft of it was published and is on the Better Policy Project website that explains everything about decision-making process and so on. So case A and case B scenarios are put in front of the policymakers, and on decision day, they get to decide what their policy action is individually, as well as to use the case A and case B scenarios as well as language to try and nudge market interest rates up or down towards these illustrative case A or case B, or in the monetary policy report, they might have in mind different types of scenarios that they're concerned about or concerned about avoiding, in which case they might not refer explicitly to the illustrative case A and case B scenarios, but they might talk about a case X or a case Y scenarios where, uh, kind of their worst fear kind of scenarios that would explain why they're, being more conservative in adjusting interest rates. So the transmission mechanism is really, really important. So Ben Bernanke, um, one of the great quotes that he had when he was chair was the importance of central bank communications. He is reviewing the Bank of England's framework right now. There's some speculation that he will recommend what he recommended for the Fed, which is something like a dot plot, which is you ask the FOMC members, what their forecasts of the Fed funds rate and inflation and growth and unemployment and so on. We do not recommend that. That is the thing that's stopping them from being an FPAS central bank, because you simply can't connect those dots. So we don't know whose inflation forecast in those dots is whose growth forecast is whose interest rate forecast. So it doesn't satisfy those three essential ingredients for an FPAS central bank, that in any scenario, we have to understand where is the economy today, what are the underlying forces, and what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives. And that's important for transparency about the monetary policy framework. And in fact, the central banks that invested in these FPAS frameworks, this goes all the way back to the 1990s. The advanced economy central banks like the Fed and the Bank of England and the ECB are very late to this game of developing FPAS frameworks. One of the reasons for that, I would say, is the history of very complex institutions like the Fed and the ECB and so on. But much smaller countries like New Zealand and the Czech Republic and so on, they kind of messed up a lot in the 1970s by allowing long-term inflation expectations to ratchet up in response to supply shocks and so on. And so they tried their best to develop these frameworks. And one of the principles behind it was monetary policy transparency. And the idea is that if you give the central bank independence, either instrument independence or instrument and goal independence, that you have to hold them accountable. And the problem is under flexible inflation targeting, how do you hold them accountable? And one aspect, I would say absolutely critical aspect, is very, very high levels of transparency about the analytical framework, about the decision-making process, and so on. And so this is just going back, constructing measures of the central bank transparency index. This is a project that is headed by Asyakostanyan at the Better Policy Project, where she does this research with researchers and other central banks, where they use this methodology to calculate a time series of how monetary policy transparency has evolved over time. So if you look at all of them, all the country cases, they're similar in the sense that transparency usually started off with no framework to speak of, no analytical framework to speak of, where you basically would have an objective for inflation and usually maybe a press conference. So that would be the very beginning of what we call inflation targeting light. And then, of course, that would result in problems like it did in New Zealand, where they tried to target inflation on a period by period basis, keep it in a narrow range, and that resulted in big instability. Thus, they needed to think more in terms of a forward looking analytical framework to more efficiently manage the short run output inflation trade off. And so that's what we called inflation forecast targeting, because we were using the central bank's forecast of inflation as an intermediate target, okay, to guide that intermediate target back to the long-term target in a way that efficiently managed the short-run output inflation target, uh, inflation output uh, trade-off. And so the idea is it's an ideal inter- intermediate target because it finds the path of the central bank's forecast back to the target in a way that efficiently manages the short run output inflation trade-off. So we refer to that in two phases. One, before they publish the path for the policy rate that's consistent with that forecast, and then of course after they publish that, we refer to full-fledged inflation forecast targeting. In our recent papers and books and stuff, we refer to it also as flexible inflation targeting. So we're going to use the term inflation forecast targeting and flexible inflation targeting synonymously and so on. Okay, so this is just the beginning in New Zealand, and this will happen in the UK. This will happen at the Fed. This will happen at the ECB. You start somewhere, okay, initially by just making your objectives clear. And so the Fed and the ECB and the Bank of Japan now satisfy that criteria that they all have 2% targets, numerical targets. And then you start building out the framework. And then as the policymakers get more comfortable with the framework, you start publishing more and more information about it, or that's how it worked under FS Mark 1. This transparency index now is being reviewed to ask how does it need to be extended to incorporate Mark II principles that emphasize uncertainty and nonlinearities, and of course, scenarios-based forward guidance and so on. So that is kind of where we are at this point. Now, just to recap a little bit about why we're doing this research, last week we talked about the Bank of Japan and the ECB, both of which were caught in low inflation traps. The Bank of Japan had been caught in a low inflation trap for decades. I remember the lost decade, that was the 1990s. Well, it's been now over 3 decades and so on. And the problem with being stuck in a low inflation trap is that your policy rate is constrained by the effective lower bound. ECB, they were also stuck in a low inflation trap up until COVID. Long-term inflation expectations from the bond markets and financial markets was suggesting that long-term inflation expectations were well below the 2% target, 1.5 type of number. Why is that concerning? It's concerning because if you're fighting to get inflation up, and a shock comes along like COVID, and we're specifically referring to the first phase of COVID, where there was a big contractionary demand shock. There were lockdowns, but but aggregate demand fell clearly by more than aggregate supply because of an increase in precautionary saving. Obviously, nobody's going to invest when you're locking economies down. You have no idea. There's no solution for COVID on the horizon. There's no vaccine. The joint mission, China World Health Organization, when they got back in February 2020, and people saw the extreme measures that were being taken to contain COVID-19 in China, they just realized there's no way that we will be able to impose such harsh measures in most democracies. So obviously, uncertainty increased massively. Investment fell. People stopped spending. But in addition to that, because people weren't able to spend on the types of goods and services that they wanted to, good example would be international airline travel. A person that wanted to take a vacation to New Zealand, are they going to substitute towards a vacation in their country, or are they going to save up the money and wait until they can go to New Zealand? So, for many cases, the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, or people's propensity to substitute over time, is higher than substituting between vacations at a point in time, or the intra elasticity of substitution. And so, for both those reasons, aggregate demand fell by more than aggregate supply, and so on. And so we looked at the experiences of the Euro area and the US, and concluded that the very aggressive monetary and fiscal policy in the US was successful at anchoring long-term inflation expectations to 2%. In other words, it had fallen, and they got it back up to 2%, but not so in the Euro area. And as a result of that, lower long-term inflation expectations means a lower price level in the future, means higher relative real interest rates relative to the United States. And that means a appreciation in the euro, which is what actually happened during a time when their growth outlook was substantially weaker than in the United States. So that's obviously a problem that the euro area macro policy framework, having already been vulnerable to low inflation trap before COVID. Now, these problems were exacerbated in the early stages of COVID. So, one way to ask, what are the welfare consequences of not having this macro framework in Japan and at the ECB, is to ask what is the additional variability that's imposed on the economy when you're constrained by the effect of lower bound, and that shock comes along, like COVID, where because you haven't created enough policy space by being successful at anchoring long-term inflation expectations at 2%. Okay, you don't have that policy space, like they didn't have that policy space going into COVID. Okay, now that's not going to be the case for any open economy. Okay, because open economies can always use an FX intervention strategy to basically depreciate the currency. And so, if one thinks about the exchange rate as an instrument of monetary policy, which I'm going to show you shortly, then obviously you can overcome the problem of ever being concerned about getting stuck in a low inflation trap. It just doesn't make any sense. No central bank that has the legal authority to purchase unlimited amounts of foreign assets should ever get stuck in a low inflation trap. So, an interesting question is, had the Bank of Japan done this in the early 1990s, okay, that would have avoided all the massive QE, all the humongous buildup in government debt that was used unsuccessfully from escaping from a low inflation trap. So, had they simply done an FX intervention strategy early on, now, of course, in that discussion, people would say, well, the reason would be is that the U.S. Treasury would complain that they are depreciating the current, manipulating exchange rates and creating trade distortions. But I would like you to think, okay, that had such a policy been successful, would Japan be a much safer place today? Would the euro be a much safer place today? And I think the argument, looking back, is that the answer certainly would be yes, if they would have been successful, using an FX intervention strategy. Now, to do that, that's not as easy as you think, because the reason why it was successful, as I will explain now, is that you have to have an FX intervention strategy to add it on to some existing framework. And if you don't have an existing framework to add it on to, it becomes much trickier, because you're using this FX intervention strategy of depreciating the currency as an unconventional tool, okay, that would only be used in times where you were constrained by the effect of lower bound on interest rates, which means that you need to have a framework to exit to, and a framework to exit from, if one wants to talk coherently about consistent policy frameworks. And so the story of the Czech Republic actually starts off in a Czech restaurant in 2020, when we were working with many central banks, including the Czech National Banks, that were lost. They had adopted inflation targeting in the late 1990s. This was the Asian financial crisis that threw lots of emerging markets into the inflation targeting world. And what does that actually mean, being thrown into the inflation targeting world? Well, if you had a pegged exchange rate before that, it would mean that you have almost zero knowledge about conducting monetary policy under a flexible exchange rate. Okay, and that's going to be really important, because it takes time back then, somewhere between 2 and 3 years, to actually adopt an FPAS framework. And we're going to explain what that is. Some people think it's just a bunch of models that tell you the answers to things, but it's really about developing the human capital and the internal procedures and processes, everything that's explained in the book, The Central Bank of Armenia. That's the most comprehensive document that has ever been published that explains all aspects of a forecasting and policy analysis system. Now, in the case of the Czech Republic, after a few years, we had developed analytical framework that was published in 2003. Okay, so that means inflation targeting adopted in 98, book with framework published in 2003. So there are 5 years with a bit of a publication lag, about 4 years, where basically they didn't have a framework that they were using to coordinate the staff and so on. So and that was problematic, as is explained in the book, what is referred to as the checkbook, on the right-hand side of the screen. But again, that book served as the foundation from which, as policymakers became more and more comfortable with the depiction of the monetary transmission mechanism, they started to publish more and more, including the endogenous interest rate path in 2008, and even the exchange rate in 2009. So let me talk and go back a little bit, and talk about the kinds of recommendations that I give for models back then. Amazingly, my recommendations today are very similar to what they were back then. I think in many respects we've gone backwards, but let me explain what I did and what I recommended the check. So the first thing is, at the very same time that I was helping central banks like the Czech Republic, we were building models. So I was the head of the economic modeling division in the research department of the IMF, and Ken Rogoff had just become the economic counselor in the early 2000s, and he wanted me to build a new open economy macro model. So I built a DSG model for the Czech National Bank. At the same time, I built a little semi-structural gap model and so on. But I would have never recommended that the DSG model ever be used as a production machine. And unfortunately, it is being used as a production machine, not just at the Czech National Bank these days, but in many central banks. That's regrettable, because those models incorporate a transmission channel that is simply way too forward-looking. Okay, so in those models, even though after you include a host of different kinds of rigidities, nominal and real rigidities, the expectational channels in those models are simply too strong to be taken to the data. And so I simply have no idea why people are doing that, and why they think it's even necessary to do that. In the real world, we observe, I think, transmission mechanisms that are a bit slower, and where expectational channels are too not trustworthy, assuming that the economy works as smoothly in a DSG model, and that expectations will adjust depending on the behavior of the central bank is foolhardy, and so on. But at the very same time, back in the early 2000s, one of the incredible insights that I was using the model to illuminate on was the trend in the Czech real exchange rate. Okay, which was like, we were expecting it to be a very strong 5%. And why is that? It was simply a Balassa-Samuelson story, okay, that wasn't quite sufficient, in the sense that Balassa-Samuelson was impossible to explain why the real exchange rate would appreciate that aggressively. It was really a shift towards quality of Czech products, and this has showed up in all kinds of research later on, that that to think about trends in real exchange rates that were that large, particularly in the transition countries in Europe that they were producing Czech Skodas that were junk that eventually transformed themselves into uh, using technology from Volkswagen and then keeping the Czech name. So the market for those products were absolutely enormous. And as the Czechs showed, if you could keep the labor costs down, and that productivity advantage was going to show up in a massive increase in the demand for your Czech Skodas and so on. And so we had supporting DSG models, which we recommended, but we simply don't recommend using something like that as your core production projection model because its dynamic structure is simply too tight to be consistent with the data and a plausible representation of the transmission channel. Now, the other things for open economies, having some idea of the global economy, so obviously some sort of global projection model is required to help think through those kinds of issues. And then a quarterly projection model, which is a semi-structural model that we would say embraces from theory, but doesn't marry it. Okay? In other words, take some of the restrictions, homogeneity restrictions, no long-run trade-offs, idea of nominal and real rigidities, takes all those things on board, but does not choose a dynamic optimization theory to motivate the actual dynamic equations in the model. And then, of course, a host of short-term forecasting models. Now, the way it was organized and the mistake, I'm going to be quite clear about the mistakes that I made advising central banks. And probably the biggest mistake that we learned when it came time to incorporate the ideas of Mark II in the next generation was the idea of specialization. That under the old FS Mark I, you had a group of people that would be responsible for current analysis and near-term forecasting. You would have a group of people that would be responsible for quarterly projections, and you'd have a group of people responsible for global projections. And we don't like that anymore. That results in too much inefficiency because you have to coordinate all those people, and so it's impossible to get the coordination that we need. Much better to train people that know all of these different types of skills and can basically do all the tasks of current analysis and quarterly projections and writing the monetary policy report and so on. So this is what it looks like. So this is taken from an inflation report of the Czech National Bank in 2008. And so this is just before the Lehman's crisis, which happened on September 15th. So the Czechs, open economy. Let me emphasize, they do not have a crystal ball at the Czech National Bank on the basis of just looking at consensus forecasts, in other words, forecasts from consensus economics, which embodied a slowdown in growth, particularly in their neighboring country, Germany. Okay, so back then they were pretty tightly linked to Germany. So based on that slowdown in the global outlook, plus, and this is the part that's kind of fun, plus I would say some current analysis that suggested that a lot of the uh, prices that were keeping inflation really high. And so in the chart, you can see headline inflation was 7%. One has to remember that the price of oil in July of 2008, just before Lehman's, was $150. So there was commodity prices that were putting upward prices or upward pressure on inflation that were expected to fall out of the year-on-year calculation, plus some other regulated prices that were also uh, affecting the year-on-year calculation that were going to fall out of it. So the combination of expecting weakness in the global economy, as well as these temporary factors that were influencing headline inflation, made the staff at the central bank produce this baseline. And just to be clear, what is it? Um, it's a forecast that is described in the preamble of the Czech inflation report as a forecast that is drawn up by the monetary policy department and used as a frame of reference for them to have a discussion about monetary policy. And so obviously the board, in reading this particular scenario, went along with it and cut interest rates before the Lehman event on September 15th. This is interesting because the ECB had just raised interest rates again because they didn't have this framework, and they were clearly responding to these high contemporaneous inflationary forces and not looking forward and factoring in a slowdown and so on. So I want to emphasize that it's not that the Czech National Bank forecast the global financial crisis. They were just forecasting that it was likely that the forces driving the global economy were likely to slow down, and that information was embodied. Now, how would you describe? I want to go back a little bit to the history of these frameworks and so on. And so remember, when you're thrown off a pegged exchange rate, you have no knowledge about monetary policy. And so what I would describe it as the staff at the Czech National Bank, as well as many other countries, okay, would have to be learning about monetary policy, okay, and then providing recommendations to the board, okay, which in many cases the board would sort of feel like maybe the staff might have a comparative analogy, a comparative advantage, actually understanding the economy and so on. So I think one of the things that's different under Mark II, okay, particularly given the institutional framework of the Central Bank of Armenia, which is very similar to the Czech National Bank, where there's supposed to be individual board accountability. Okay. So obviously, at some point, one would hope that the frameworks like the Czech National Bank would mature to the point where the staff are not advisors about monetary policy, but are the best of the best analysts that provide the policymakers the material that they need to have a very rich and informed discussion amongst themselves and with the staff to then determine monetary policy and to communicate it as efficiently as they can. Now, the Czech National Bank, I think, was in many ways a leader okay, in terms of how they used what I would describe as conventional forward guidance. But again, based on this framework where the staff are playing this very important role of providing this baseline forecast, okay, that is believable to the board, where the board then endorses it. And then, of course, once they publish that expected path for the policy rate, the market then adjusts the expected path in a way that is consistent with the direction that the central bank is trying to nudge interest rates. So this is a good example. They started publishing in 2008, and so this is an example where they publish the forecast, and before they've actually published the interest rate path, and asked, how does that path compare to what's in the market? And then this is taken from paper that I did with the Czechs that looks at various periods where they would publish the expected path, sometimes with a baseline and sometimes with an alternative scenario. And I think the main message that comes out of this paper, so there's a paper by Clinton and others, but it's by Kevin Clinton, myself, various authors at the IMF, and as well as Thomas Holub and Tibor Hudlik. So these guys were the guys that were running the policy framework at the Czech National Bank. So we go back to some examples where they publish the baseline, and the board is on board about the baseline, and then market interest rates move in the direction that's consistent with the publication, right? So you'd say that is a good thing. Okay, that's what you would say under FS Mark 1. The problem is, what if the board doesn't agree with the baseline and wants to have an alternative, and so on? And so the problem is there. How does the market interpret what is going on? Because you've been in this baseline world using that, and then all of a sudden you publish an alternative scenario. So I would say my first piece of advice to the Czechs would be investigate this FPAS Mark II, because I think one of the biggest advantages of it is that it provides a much more constructive discussion between the staff and the board, as well as between the various board members, and so on. It also, the way that it's organized, allows the staff to produce what I think is the best possible monetary policy report. So I'm not going to talk about that. You can read about the whole interpretation of what happened in financial markets in that paper by Kevin Clinton and others. What I want to talk about is the FX intervention strategy. So there was a recent debate at the Czech National Bank where they talked about uncertainty in the neutral interest rate, and the staff, which have gotten used to FPAS Mark 1, too much emphasis on linear models, too much emphasis on the model says kind of philosophy that you get from academia and so on. And the board, the governor's interested in the implications of uncertainty and the neutral interest rate. And so that's a very interesting question that any staff of any central bank should be doing research on to understand the implications of it. and the response to that, in terms of thinking about policy issues, is kind of obvious. If you were to believe in the Larry Summers view that the neutral interest rate and the term premium is much higher than what's currently priced in financial markets, then you would need to be wary in a central bank where you have integrated capital markets, liberalized capital markets, about trying to keep the interest rate from this higher neutral rate. So, in other words, if we're all learning what the neutral interest rate is, you should be very worried about people that treat the neutral rate like it's some fixed constant, where they might think that they require overwhelming evidence of changing it. That particular strategy could be very dangerous in a world where the interest rate was higher than what was in your baseline assumptions. So that's one important insight, that you could fall behind shifts in inflation expectations and allow inflationary pressures to set in if you failed to adjust your neutral or interest rate up quick enough. Okay. At the very same time, Maury Upsfeld, following on the work of Olivier Glashard, is concerned that the neutral interest rate might actually be much lower than what Larry Summers might think, meaning that that you would be concerned about policy being potentially constrained by the effective lower bound. So where does that take you? Well, it takes you into going back to the period of 2013, where the Czech National Bank was constrained by the effective lower bound, okay, and developed this FX intervention strategy to try to deal with the implications of the effective lower bound on interest rates. It was a very novel framework, one that if one goes back to the Article 4s of the International Monetary Fund, you'll see that that they said that as long as the Czech National Bank is doing this for macro stability reasons, they have no reason to say anything bad about it, and so on. But what were the good things about the framework, and what were the things that could be improved? So the answer to the governor of the Czech National Bank, if he's concerned about uncertainty in the neutral interest rate, is obviously to be concerned on the upside for the reasons that I mentioned. But the reason for being concerned on the downside is that he would want to be investing significant resources, developing a framework that could deal with the effective lower bound on interest rates, and building off of the experiences that the Czech National Bank had in 2013. They should definitely start there and go back and actually improve the analytical framework. Back then, they didn't have the time that they would have today, possibly, to develop that framework and to get it ready if the world were to enter back into a world of policy space being constrained by the effective lower bound. So what was the magic about it? And it's a magic that any central bank can have if they have legal authority to purchase unlimited amounts of foreign assets. And so the first thing that I would say that made it special was getting the message out that the exchange rate tool was being used as an instrument and never an objective. And so what they did is on November 7th, 2013, having been constrained by the effective lower bound for, I think, over a year at this point, they they said, we're imposing an exchange rate floor equal to 27 krona to the euro. Now, what happened? Well, within a couple days, the exchange rate depreciated through the exchange rate floor with very little interventions, like $10 billion over a few days. And that makes sense. That makes sense because, if you're in a situation where inflation is below the target, the economy is weak, okay, and you've got a transmission channel where the exchange rate is playing a very important role, okay, in terms of influencing traded goods prices. And of course, if you can depreciate the real exchange rate and you're selling into a market where that improvement in competitiveness is likely to result in higher demand for your exports. And if people believe that this depreciation in the currency is going to be inflationary, and so that means lower real interest rates, looser financial conditions on households and businesses. And so if those conditions are satisfied, then you should be able to depreciate the currency sufficiently to completely rule out getting stuck in a low inflation trap, much like the euro area has gotten stuck or had gotten stuck before COVID. Let's see what happens where inflation lands after the issues that we're going through right now. So the big problem with Europe is that inflation was below for years, and then it went above. Okay, and so now the question is, will they get it to come back to 2, or will they undershoot? And if they undershoot, if they are too conservative in bringing inflation down, will they get stuck in a low inflation trap, or will they get stuck in a high inflation trap because they're concerned about getting stuck in a low inflation trap and are too slow to cut interest rates and so on? And so this is some very interesting dilemmas. The lesson is the exchange rate floor is an instrument, okay, which means that once that policy is explained to people in financial markets, then how does the exchange rate work? Well, on days when there's bad information hitting the Czech Republic, so these are like the little blue lines above the red line, you would see that the value of the Czech krona would depreciate. Okay, and that's precisely what you want to happen, so that the exchange rate is playing this role as an important shock absorber in the economy. So there are some lessons to be learned. I think very positive lessons that could be learned about this first phase of doing the FX intervention strategy, where things were working pretty good. I think the lesson that should be learned is that the Czech National Bank could have done a lot better job at explaining the policy to the public and to the media and to the politicians, that they were doing this policy not just to create inflation, but to support the economy, to prevent unnecessary increases in unemployment and lower confidence that you would get if you didn't do anything and allowed your economy to get stuck in a low inflation trap. And so I think that that is one of the big lessons that the Czech National Bank needed to do a much better job at basic economic and financial literacy to the Czech population, that it just didn't care about inflation. Most of the time, just stabilizing it and then increasing it when you needed to increase it, but they actually cared about unemployment and full employment and so on. And had they done that, I think they would have developed a stronger institution that would have helped insulate them from the kinds of pressure that they've been feeling in the second phase of COVID, where inflation has been obviously much higher and they've had to raise interest rates and so on. So what does this mean if you're concerned? So first of all, the experiences of the Czech National Bank, they faced in 2013 and 2014 a sequence of contractionary shocks related to the European debt crisis and so on. But the policy eventually was successful. They escaped from the low inflation trap. And what that meant is that when they went into COVID, they, like the US, had some policy space that they could use in that first phase of COVID. Now, what is it that we would recommend, and what kind of lessons would we take away from this? Is one is we need to develop the analytical framework that involves switching, regime switching. So when we think of this as economists, there's the normal regime where you think in terms of influencing the expected path of the policy rate and longer term market interest rates and so on, as well as the exchange rate through expected interest rate differentials, to a different world when you're constrained by the effective lower bound. There has to be another regime that you're informing the public and financial markets about. And in fact, if you do that, just the possibility that you've got that regime all worked out so that financial markets know that you're going to be employing it, that in and of itself should help provide some some shock absorbing capacity for your economy that actually rules out to some extent the possibility of having to employ that alternative policy. But the fact that the Czechs have actually done it and have an historical precedent that is pretty good should mean that if they were to develop a framework that incorporates it explicitly, okay, that should be easier for them. But the rest of the world that is concerned about the effective lower bound will obviously want to invest in that. So I would say, we should be concerned about uncertainty in the neutral interest rate, both in the upward and the downward direction. It's pretty clear that what to do in the Czech National Bank build off of what you've done in the past and improve the analytical framework and communication framework, emphasizing, I would say, the dual mandate more to improve the political legitimacy of monetary policy. So I think I will leave it there. There's an incredible opportunity for people that are interested in research on monetary policy issues. Uncertainty in the neutral interest rate, uncertainty in the natural rate of unemployment, uncertainty in potential output, uncertainty about how the economy works. I mean, plus we have finally an experience like the second phase of COVID, where we have these nasty stagflationary shocks that have affected everybody because of COVID and so on. That it provides a another incredible opportunity that researchers can use to study differences in monetary policy frameworks and their strengths and their weaknesses. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there and wait for the students to recover, hopefully soon, from both their COVID experience and the dentist issues. So, Vaz, do you have any last words? Vaz is putting the team together. The next Mark II team at the Central Bank of Armenia. And so we're going to be introducing like a summer school in July and August, teaching everybody to do Mark II. But maybe, Vaz, you could say just a few words about what it is you're looking for on this six-person team. You have a couple places on your roster.
Okay.
So maybe you could just say a few words about what it is you're looking for.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Doug, for this great presentation. That was very interesting to listen. And secondly, as we are already like 15 minutes, almost 15 minutes late, so I'll be very, very brief on that. So what kind of people we are looking at is that we are kind of looking for kind of generalists, some complete economists, some like people like young talents or talents that are striving for excellence and are ready to put their all, I would say, to become a complete economist in some sense, as we, for example, compare what our requirements are from the economists under FPAS Mark II and compared to what those requirements were under FPAS Mark I. So usually we compare the football with the volleyball game. And I would say that under football, so there are exact roles and responsibilities of any players in some exact position. So there are strikers, there are defenders, there are midfielders, goalkeepers, and so on. But under a volleyball game, so we have some rotational system that every player plays at any position and has to be good at any position and any role. So he or she has to serve well, he or she has to block the balls well, to hit the ball well, and so he or she, so they had to be good at least good at everything. So to be very brief, we are looking for this kind of people, and there are, I would say, there is kind of unlimited possibilities for them to develop under FPAS Mark II in the dynamic learning environment that we provide.
Good, thanks, Vaz. And so thanks for anyone, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're interested in following the central bank watchers applying these FPAS Mark II frameworks to other countries, either in the past, okay, as a counterfactual exercise, which Larry Summers suggested we do more of, as well as the current situation. So we'll see you on Thursday for our next seminar, where hopefully the students will be back.